I'm going to try and give you an overview of AGS from a parent and advocate's perspective. And to the best of my ability, I'm going to try and answer these 4 questions. I'm going to start by taking a look at how AGS affects families emotionally. I want to try to explain this disease to you, but I want to ground it in a real sense in our day-to-day. And then I'm going to offer a quick explanation of how the disease works. And I think the context is important because it helps explain a little bit where I think our opportunities lie. And we want to make sure to cover available treatments. And then I'm going to offer our perspective about what's coming, what's on the horizon for AGS. And again, that's been developed from about a year or so of networking. So what is AGS? It's every one of these kids. And these are all young people whose lives are impacted in deep and meaningful ways. AGS almost always results in physical disability, sometimes what we call profound disability. But sometimes even between siblings, like the 2 on the left, the consequences can be unpredictably different. And we have an idea why this is the case, but admittedly, it still confuses and surprises me every time. And I'm reminded of something Dr. Laura Edeng said from CHOP. I'm going to allude to her again. She told me last year that she now almost always tests for AGS because it can be so different and unexpected. And, admittedly, that's in the context of a children's hospital that specializes in leukodystrophies and comes from a pediatric neurologist, so AGS still belongs in a pretty specific category. But the disease bucks a simple, straightforward explanation, and that complicates our attempts to describe it, write care guidelines, and measure changes in clinical trials. But we'll talk about clinical trials later. I want to show you more kids. And I actually asked parents to share pictures that embody what AGS means to them. And I expected things like pictures of living rooms full of equipment. And I got 1 or 2 of those. But for the most part, people just shared smiling pictures of their families, right? And I'll share what a couple of them said along with the pictures. I heard that this is a hospital picture from April. It shows strength and smiles throughout the pain and suffering. I heard that AGS kiddos have the best hair and the most contagious smiles, always making the best of life and bringing joy to others. We heard that AGS, because it's a life-limiting condition, means that you have to make the most of the life that you have. Think positive, be positive, and make the most of every good day. But I also heard that it's hard and painful. And I know this. I'm an AGS parent, and I think, you do. Other parents here know this too. And we also recognize and know this because some of our kids and their families are struggling. Now, I got a lot of pictures, and I felt the obligation and responsibility to show as many as I received, so they're all here. It's going to take me a minute to get through them all. I think these scenes are interesting to me because they look an awful lot like my house and my family. I have millions of pictures that look the same. I did get a caption that I didn't write down, but the picture on the left was that this boy used all of his energy to walk himself and communicate to his parents that he wanted to go outside to see the snow. So he got to do it. And let's see if it comes through. It's telling me that the pictures don't work, but I promise I had pictures of my daughter that I wanted to show you. And I wonder what happened. So now for this presentation, I asked families how this disease has affected them. And truthfully, because this is most often an early childhood disease, I focused on the parent perspective. But adults and children living with AGS have a lot of their own to say, and I want to let you know that we're beginning to provide them with a platform to do so through our podcast. So if you want to share, you can contact us, and everyone else subscribe to hear a different perspective than this, the parent perspective, straight from the source. But back to the parents, I selected some choice quotes, and I arranged them from left to right You might say a little more negative on the left, more positive on the right. And as you read some of these, I kind of propose that you think about these as not representing a distinct or unique attitude and perspective, but rather they all represent a continuum of feelings that all of us truthfully travel through. And I know, and I can share from my own experience, that my answers to this question probably change month to month, week to week, or even hour by hour. It's an emotional carousel, and it can be really dizzying at times. But despite that, most of us, I believe, try and manage to find a balance. We mourn and we sometimes grieve, but we move forward and make the best of our time together. And you'll notice that uncertainty is a really big contributor to the stress and anxiety that we feel. I think the uncertainty is that we don't know. Truthfully, we don't know sometimes if we're in the early stages of mourning our children or if we should be preparing for a long life that happens to include disability and chronic illness. But when we can manage that anxiety, if we can redirect it, it sometimes means that we can really cherish our moments as parents and put effort into the growth and development of our families. So I don't see this in families that haven't been touched by something like AGS. I think I see it in most of the families here at the ULF conference. But I wouldn't expect other people to have this experience or to be able to relate anyway. And I just want to share, I wasn't surprised by this, but for some reason, this question also seemed to highlight that pretty much everybody's kids think farts are hilarious. And I think you know what I'm talking about. But, you know, I think what it means is that we can't be doom and gloom all the time. And our kids with AGS are still kids. Okay, so now I have some more drier stuff. So I'm going to talk a little bit about symptoms and clinical features. And I can't get too specific, but I just kind of want to give you a sense of it. So, you know, we're here at the conference for leukodystrophies, right? So it should be pretty obvious and clear to everyone that AGS is primarily a brain disease. The consequences of AGS-related brain damage can be profound, and it's very likely to be the consequence of the disease that has the most impact on the life of someone with AGS. The associated brain damage or brain inflammation will likely probably cause disability, can result in seizures, and will probably lead to secondary issues like the inability to speak, eat, swallow by mouth. And there may be uncontrollable movements or orthopedic issues because the brain can't control muscles properly. A person with AGS can even lose the ability to regulate their heart rate, temperature, and blood pressure. But I think that we all kind of get this because it's visible. These are the things that we can see. These are the visible effects of the disease to us. But I want to be very clear that there is much more going on. And even if we don't have specific numbers, there have been lots of publications over the years highlighting all sorts of systemic complications. Because AGS is an immune disease, the effects of having an overactive and reactive immune system can damage almost every organ in the body, including the immune system itself. Now, we don't yet have numbers or very clear numbers on how often some of these specific issues arise. So many of us are doing a lot of annual testing for things like glaucoma and pulmonary hypertension. And, you know, I can only speculate on why these systemic issues occur. But I do think there's a commonly held belief that the inflammatory signals in AGS weaken and damage small blood vessels, which leads to organ damage. But regardless of why this other organ damage occurs, it means that a person with AGS should probably be thought of as having a serious chronic illness in addition to having a brain disease and disability. And I want to say that one of the ways that we're going to learn and be able to clearly describe these symptoms is through the natural history studies being done at CHOP that Dr. Gavazzi is going to share, and he is going to share some novel information about systemic involvement in AGS. And I think it's the kind of information that we all need to anticipate things for our kids. But for now, on our website, we have a work-in-progress booklet that covers a lot of these chronic symptoms and effects. And while it's not exactly an easy read for families, I do think it would be worthwhile to take a look and share with your doctor. Now, I also asked parents what symptoms have had the biggest impact on the lives of their children, and this, again, is just a sampling of what some of them said. And, while you read these, I'm going to share that we held a focus group with a number of families last year with a drug company, and a similar question or similar questions were asked and answered. And at the time, I was really surprised at how much consensus there was about communication, or let's say difficulty with communication, being the most impactful consequence to most or many families. So for those families, it's not necessarily the disability or the lack of independence that causes the most difficulty. It's the struggle we have to communicate effectively with our kids. I share this struggle too. But that's not everyone. And many children with AGS are dealing with pain or life-threatening complications. And it's because AGS has a wide spread. So this is one of the things that Dr. Gvazzi, I know, has in his presentation, so I'm going to cover it from my perspective. This is the AGS scale. It's the way that we have at the moment to measure and think about the severity of AGS using a scale that was developed at CHOP. The AGS scale is a way for doctors to measure how severe the outcomes are for people with AGS. And so this wonderful team at CHOP here developed a short, simple questionnaire, and it scores the severity of a person's, quote, overall global neurologic dysfunction, basically the severity of their brain damage. And so there's a list of 11 features, and they're on the left. And so for each item in the list, a patient can receive 1 point. If this feature applies to you or you have this feature, there's a point. And you add up all the points for all the person's features, and the maximum score is 11. And so I want to step through the first 4. Normocephaly. It's the absence of microcephaly. Microcephaly is a small head size, which can happen if there's brain damage really early on in life. The brain doesn't grow at the same rate, and therefore the skull and the head doesn't grow at the same rate. Social smile would be the ability to smile in response to your mom or your dad or friend coming in the room, right? Communicating through a smile that you are paying attention and you're aware of their presence. Vocalizations like cooing or babbling would be, say, the ability to get attention by making noise, having your parents pay attention to you or get their attention. And single meaningful words might be a word like mom or dad, just the ability to use a single word to communicate. And I want to stop there. So if you only have those 4, we've described a score of 4 on the scale, and it lands you kind of right around the boundary of what doctors would consider severe or moderate AGS. And on the rightmost chart, each triangle here represents an individual child and his or her score. And so the majority of children with AGS that were measured here for this publication would score about 4 or below. And I think that's extremely sobering. It means that they lack the ability to speak, hold their heads up, grasp things with their hands. Truthfully, independence has been completely robbed from them by this disease. And communication, it's not impossible, but it's difficult. It's extremely challenging in those cases. And so this scale continues all the way up to independent walking. And I want to point out that the 3 AGS types on the right, there are children that are profoundly, I clicked ahead. There are children that are profoundly disabled that have AGS associated with these genes. And there are children that are walking around and playing baseball. And, the swing here is really wide. But I don't want to confuse you. I'm not suggesting that mildly affected children are not hurt by this disease. They still very much are. This disease is just very difficult to capture in very simple terms. So I'm going to cover this and hopefully do it quickly and well, but as of right now, we typically associate 9 different genes with AGS. And I believe Dr. Vandiver told us last year at our family symposium that these genes, these 9, account for about 85% of the cases that she sees in clinic. It's going to be really hard for me to explain genetics in any sufficient way, but I kind of have to try a little bit. because it's going to be relevant to the next couple of slides. So what I'll say is that the instructions for life, you've heard of your DNA, they can be broken down into units. And there are a lot of caveats here, but these units are called genes, and they specify the order of molecular building blocks that are assembled into molecules called proteins. And we have about 20 to 25,000 genes in our DNA. And the proteins that they specify often have very specific purposes, and they interact with other very specific proteins and molecules. These interactions are charted on this graph here. So everything about you, about life on Earth, it all arises from the interactions of these molecules inside and outside the 100 trillion cells that make up the human body. And like those numbers are really mind-boggling, so this is a severe simplification. But AGS can be caused by a change in the instructions of just one of these associated genes, so one of these 9 out of 25,000, that ultimately causes the gene's protein to operate a little bit differently. And all of the genes associated with AGS can be thought of as having jobs, that help maintain a sensitive, fragile balance that our cells keep related to protecting us from infections. So as a result of an unfortunate change in any one of these genes, the balance is lost and our cells become convinced that they're experiencing something like a viral infection. They sound their alarms, producing interferon, which is down here at the bottom of the chart. And interferon is a signaling molecule that calls up basically the National Guard and institutes martial law. Everything around the cell and in the cell tends to shut down. And while most of the genes are labeled on this diagram, these arrows show how all of these the proteins that are produced from these genes and some other molecules, it shows how they interact and the ways in which they interact to produce interferon. And so with that said, when one of you says that your kid has AGS2, it means that they have a change in the gene RNase H2B. And those changes cause it to stop working so well. But if you have AGS7, it means that you have a change in the gene IFIH1 that causes it to work too well. And I actually picked these two because, to me, it's kind of like they're cousins. They have different parents, but they're from the same overall family. And ultimately, these genes can cause an overproduction of interferon, but they do so in slightly different ways by interacting with their different parents. And so just kind of as an example, I organized them on the right under 2 different categories under their different parents. And I did that because I think in the coming years, we are probably going to see medicines that target specific parents. And so right now, we're all in the same boat. Those of us using JAK inhibitors like baricitinib or ruxolitinib, these drugs, they have very broad effects on things that are well after any of the AGS genes have sounded the interferon alarm or triggered the interferon alarm. But in the future, I think that we're going to have better medicines that only work on one of these categories or some other subsets of AGS. And I'm sharing this because it's not hypothetical. So in the last couple of months, I've personally had meetings with drug companies and scientists that are developing drugs and molecules that would work this way. And it's very likely the case with reverse transcriptase inhibitors now, which you can read about on our website and are in active clinical trials for AGS. But the point is that as we get closer to the source of the interferon, we expect the medicines to work better and be more specific and have fewer side effects. But it might mean that we see a split in the AGS community, medicines that work for some AGS types that may not work for others, and we may not have equal efficacy. So in terms of leukodystrophy, the AGS genes, I just explained, cause an overactive immune response, but we don't yet know exactly how that specifically results in the disease's brain damage. What we do know is that AGS results in the destruction of the brain's white matter. And that's the term, that's where the term leukodystrophy comes from, and it is why we're at the United Leukodystrophy Foundation's conference. Leuko means white, dystrophy refers to it being damaged and wasting away. And I think this graphic helps me, and I think it helps to visualize exactly what the white matter is. And so I hope that you might have heard about neurons. These are the cells in the brain that send all of the electrical signals that our brain uses to control our bodies, form our consciousness and our memories. And these neurons, where they connect, because they're distinct individual cells, but where they connect, they have an fatty insulating layer that's created by another cell type. And this insulation is called myelin. The myelin helps the electrical signals travel efficiently across the connections. And we need myelin, and we need those connections to travel efficiently from our heads all the way down to our toes for us to be able to walk. And where we have many connections and lots of myelin in the brain, we have dense bundles of neuron cables that connect different regions of the brain. And so you can imagine that without myelin and without this white matter, our brain cannot communicate as quickly or as effectively. And if there's a process that's resulting in the destruction of myelin and white matter, it can continue and it can cause further destruction and damage to the neurons themselves. And this might be a bit of a simplification, but the way that I see it is that where we see calcifications on brain MRIs, which are clusters or deposits of calcium, it means that those sections of the brain have been heavily damaged and effectively filled in with calcium. And in AGS, we often see this in the basal ganglia. This is the section of the brain that primarily controls movement. So, as it relates to leukodystrophy, we know about the interferon, and we're pretty certain it's being produced in high amounts in the brain by another cell type called astrocytes. And they're kind of like a support cell or like an immune cell. They're there to help out. But we don't really know exactly how it results in leukodystrophy and AGS. So we sometimes talk about cellular targets. In fact, Dr. Hoffer, we were talking about this earlier, that cellular targets would be the specific cells or the specific cell types that we need a drug to impact. And in AGS, we really don't know for sure which ones we need to target. So, for example, if we could magically just turn off the interferon and astrocytes, truthfully, I think we're not sure that this would cure the disease. So I bring this up because figuring this out is kind of a precursor to developing the next generation of treatments, like gene therapies and gene editing, that I'm somewhat hopeful that I'm going to see from my daughter while she's still a child. And I'm going to allude to Dr. Adang's talk, treatment modalities in leukodystrophies, where you just spoke about. In the future, we're probably going to be able to target specific cell types with certain treatment or therapy modalities. And this question needs to be solved for us to do that effectively in AGS, and it has not yet. I skipped 2. So many families find out about AGS through genetic testing. Once their doctors begin to realize that there are issues that are something more than cerebral palsy or some kind of acquired or regular infection, they might order a gene panel or whole exome sequencing. And with whole exome sequencing, a laboratory reads the DNA from a blood sample that you send them, and then it checks each gene in the blood or in the DNA against genetic databases, and it uses computer software to see if there's anything in the gene that might be associated with or potentially causing disease. And with a gene panel, they're basically doing the same thing, but they're only looking at a handful of specific genes, so it's more targeted. Microarrays aren't really relevant to us, but they are related to interferon score, which I'll talk about in a minute. But when genetic testing fails, or often if it hasn't been ordered yet, doctors might be looking at brain MRIs and noticing damage, possibly damage that follows a certain pattern associated with leukodystrophies or maybe even AGS. And in fact, it was an MRI that prompted genetic testing for my daughter. They ordered a leukodystrophy gene panel. And the answer often comes from the genetics for many of us, but that's not really where the diagnostic journey begins. So before or without obvious genetics, diagnosis can be very complicated in AGS. Many doctors still search for what we would call classical AGS symptoms or classical AGS features. Those are features that were described in early publications about AGS, and they are not always features that exist in patients, like calcifications in the brain, for example. So they might draw samples of spinal fluid. They might find that there are signs of an infection or inflammation in the brain, and that itself can be confusing. And it becomes a puzzle that can sometimes take years to solve, especially when we're working with outdated information and publications about AGS. So you might have heard about interferon score. We talk about this sometimes in our support group. Interferon score or interferon-stimulated genes or interferon signature generally means the same thing. This is usually measured from blood samples, and it tells us whether the immune system is being turned up by interferon. Now, in the United States, we don't actually have a hospital or a laboratory that's licensed to perform this test clinically. Still, I'm aware of families getting this test done anyway, both in the U.S. and around the world. But the problem is that it's kind of a research thing, and we can't rely on it yet to help diagnose families. And what's more, these values don't really tell you how severe your AGS is or is going to be. They just tell you whether or not you have it. So for the time being, kids that don't have obvious AGS genetics and that don't match the standard picture, they can go years without getting a clear diagnosis. And that likely means a significant delay in treatment. Now, one way we can speed up diagnosis is by updating the literature. We can publish more complete information from natural history studies. But what will really make the difference for AGS and probably for every rare disease is the development of newborn screening. So in the developed world, a drop of blood is typically collected from a baby at birth. They tend to prick the heel. They put a couple of spots of blood on a card. And that blood is tested for conditions that the government has on their list. So developing newborn screening for a particular disease is complicated, and it involves at least all of the steps that I have listed here. We have to identify and validate that a particular molecule can identify AGS in the first place. That's done in a laboratory. We need to collect as many newborn screening cards as possible for this because they need to be used to verify that the test may work. And that's even more complicated for us given that we have so many different genes involved in this disease. And there are details about particular AGS genes and types that make some of this even more complicated. And then once we discover or identify these molecules and we validate them, we need to run a pilot program. And that's the use of a test in a smaller group, which can be a small set of hospitals or even a whole state or a province. And we do that to demonstrate whether or not it works in practice in the real world. And eventually, it gets to the point where we, as an advocacy organization and as a community, need to advocate to have our test included in each state, province, and country on their list. And we're not going to be effective at this without showing that identifying kids early can and will make a difference. We need a proven treatment. So, like everything else, this is going to be a lot of work. But we have opportunities here too, and we've already helped collect a large number of newborn screening cards. Thank you, Nico. And our partners have identified a handful of candidate molecules. Some of this has been published. And we think we have a compelling argument about treatment. And so even though this is complicated, right now, for example, in an adjacent room, Lisa Brackbill is speaking about the Leukodystrophy Newborn Screening Action Network. So we have people that will be able to help us. My ask is that if you do have a young one, you can donate their newborn screening card. So many states and countries hold on to them for a long time. Some do not. But some hold them for years, especially California in the United States. So you can email us at info@agsaa.org, and we'll figure it out and we'll set things up. So I have to cover treatments. We have so much information about JAK inhibition, and we talk about it so much on our support group that I kind of want to run through this slide very quickly, but I think it might not be fair to do so. But we really have put an enormous amount of effort into educating families, sharing experiences, and providing resources to help families get access to JAK inhibitors. So we talk constantly about baricitinib and ruxolitinib in our support group, and this is our treatment. This is our only disease-modifying treatment at the moment. It's really all we have when we talk about available treatments. I want you to know that we as a community not the AGS-AAA, but we as a community have a paper published in the New England Journal of Medicine detailing the treatment protocol and its benefits. It shows that kids using this medicine, in this chart on the left, they gained more developmental skills using the medicine than kids when they weren't using the medicine. And we have recommendations from the American College of Rheumatology and the European Alliance of Associations for Rheumatology, or EULAR, that confirm that JAK inhibition can benefit AGS and other diseases involving interferon. But I'm going to be honest that these are powerful drugs, and we are forced at the moment to give them to our children at very high doses, higher than what these drugs are approved for adults with different conditions. So I'm also not going to lie and say that they always work. Some kids continue to experience progression of the disease, or at least relapse, despite JAK inhibition. But there are also many that describe an improvement in their sleep, their pain, and so on. And again, I want to be clear that these drugs do not fix brain damage, but when they work, they prevent more of it. And so I'm going to leave it to you all to read our testimonials because I think that they say an awful lot about this. And I'm going to just add in here that we, through our patient registry and surveys about JAK inhibition, we have about 75% of families saying that JAK inhibitors have benefited them and that they've had a positive experience with their symptoms and irritability and sleep. It's all on our website. It's agsaa.org/JAKi. But the landscape of our treatment is really rocky. And so, we feel very strongly, and I feel very strongly, that every kid with AGS should be treated with JAK inhibitors and treated as early as possible, but they often are not. We try to, as an organization, we try to contact every newly diagnosed family that we can to make sure that they understand the medicine, the situation, and the trade-offs, but we're still seeing significant delays for many families. And so we collected, through our patient registry, we collected treatment timelines from families, and we found that the average time to treatment after having a diagnosis in the last couple of years runs about 6 months. And so on this chart, each line segment represents a single person, a single individual affected by AGS. The yellow alert at the top of the line is when they began to experience symptoms or the onset of their disease as the parent reported it. The blue-looking glass is when they were formally diagnosed clinically. And the green pills are when they finally access JAK inhibitors, with some children on the right still unable to access these medicines. And I want to say that these kids, they're suffering the worst consequences of this disease potentially for years before they manage to access treatment. Now, what are the reasons for that? There are probably at least these. The barriers that they face or the obstacles might be that their doctors hesitate. Not a lot of doctors know much about AGS nor these medicines. And the doctors and the families lack the time and experience to argue and fight insurance companies. Those insurance companies that they are arguing or debating with, they immediately deny these medicines in most cases. And they have an easy time doing so because it's expensive. These medicines are expensive, and because they're prescribed at high doses, and because they lack a special designation for AGS. So we are legally allowed to use these medicines. We are legally allowed to be prescribed these medicines in most countries. But insurances and health systems typically don't have AGS and JAK inhibitors on their lists. So we seem to struggle. This is kind of another point. We seem to struggle particularly in Europe with the belief, and this might be the doctor belief, that these medicines don't work or that they're not worth using. And I want to be clear about what these medicines can and can't do. They cannot fix brain damage, but they can lessen the inflammation that causes brain damage in AGS. So we don't know who they will and won't work for, but we do believe that everyone with AGS deserves a chance. We believe that we can say that they are mostly working for the majority. And finally, the manufacturer of baricitinib, and this is the JAK inhibitor most extensively tested in AGS, I'm going to share with you that truthfully, they do not intend to invest further in AGS and baricitinib. So I'll share that our online petition that we ran, the media campaign that we ran, raised over 4,000 signatures, and we did get the attention of Eli Lilly. We had multiple meetings with representatives from the company to discuss how we might improve the situation, but unfortunately the bottom line is that they're not going to help us get this drug approved for AGS. So I don't know the answers for these. I think about this a lot, but I'm sharing it with you so that you all understand that this is a challenge that we're going to continue to face until we have better options. And that's why I'm here, that's why I'm giving this talk, and that's why we all need to work together. But we do have other opportunities on the horizon. We have active clinical trials right now for AGS. And so first, we have reverse transcriptase inhibitors. And you can read more about these on our website. We've shared on social media, and we have some information on our website about them. These are medicines that were developed to fight HIV, the virus that causes AIDS. But it also happens to mean that they've been used safely in children, and that they've been used for many years safely in children, and that they come with a much lower cost. So these drugs, if they work, if they're beneficial for us, could be combined with others like JAK inhibitors without dangerously suppressing the immune system. Reverse transcriptase inhibitors do not suppress the immune system, so they can be part of a combination therapy that might be getting some of our kids over the hurdle that they're experiencing. And I also mentioned previously that we might see medicines that target interactions closer to the AGS genes, or what we would call upstream targets. And so rather than broadly suppressing the immune system, we might actually be able to interrupt the disease without as many side effects. And these drugs are in development, but I'm truthfully uncertain whether or not or when they'll make it to the light of day. So we hope that by networking and funding projects that we can help move these forward. But I think that we should also recognize that there are other medicines for other immune diseases that may work for us, including other JAK inhibitors that may have fewer side effects. I had it written down on my paper, but I don't have it in my notes here, that AstraZeneca actually got a monoclonal antibody approved that blocks interferon alpha receptors, and it was approved for a form of lupus, SLE. There are diseases related to ours where medicines may become available, not intentionally for our disease, but we may be able to repurpose them. And just kind of as an anecdote, my child's been a patient in a clinical trial of one. She's been the recipient of a cellular therapy known to have anti-inflammatory effects. In that particular case, her doctor and I have discussed opening a trial for AGS, but testing this or other anti-inflammatory agents, or even canvassing other approved drugs to repurpose them for AGS is going to take money. But I think it's always possible that we could strike gold. And so we need, and our organization plans to establish significant fundraising efforts to raise money needed for this angle. And I want to wrap this by sharing that we've been told, sort of unofficially, but we've been told that there are as many as 11 companies in the AGS drug development pipeline. And I can't independently confirm that, but I am personally aware of at least 3. And I think that if we want these companies to invest in AGS, we need to organize, engage, and participate in research as a community. In terms of open clinical trials, we've got some information about these on our website. At the moment, these are for reverse transcriptase inhibitors and CHOP's natural history study under the protocol, the Myelin Disorders Biorepository Project. But I want to emphasize, as I wrap up, because I'm nearing the end here, that we want to be able to run effective clinical trials in AGS. And that does not mean that the medicines are effective. What it means is that the conclusion of the clinical trial is unambiguous and definitive. An effective clinical trial is going to measure things that are important to families, and it will demonstrate clearly whether a medicine has a benefit or not. And in the baricitinib trial, the outcomes that described benefit were developed retrospectively. And this means that we ran this trial, but we tried to justify the benefits of these medicines after it had begun. And health agencies, they won't go for this. So we're getting in front of this now with a collaboration with CHOP to develop outcome measures that can be used in future clinical trials. And the only way that I know of, and I say that with a smile because I'm not an expert, but the only way that I know of to design an effective clinical trial for a rare disease like AGS requires a robust natural history study, a natural history of a disease, an engaged and active community, and a feedback loop that brings the concerns of the community to the forefront. So we are very fortunate, I think, to have some of the pieces of this underway, and we're going to hear about a big part of it from Dr. Francesco Gavazzi in just a bit. And so finally, I'm basically done, but before I offer to take any questions, I just want to touch on what you can do as AGS friends or family to help us make progress. The first thing that you can do is follow us on social media. Our channels are linked at agsaa.org/socials. But in active terms, you can donate your newborn screening cards. You can enroll and participate in our patient registry. And with respect to our patient registry, you can help us select topics and design surveys about things that you want or need to know. And please share and reshare us on social media. Tell your network about AGS, friends and family. Promote the AGSAA in our posts, because we're always going to need to raise awareness and funds, truthfully, if we're going to make a difference. And I wrote please multiple times here, but I'm going to say it one time. Please educate yourself about research opportunities and clinical trials available in AGS. We're willing to do the heavy lifting and provide information on our website, but we need as many people as possible participating in trials for them to be effective. And, we have more than we can realistically do. And so if you raise your hand to volunteer, we will try and give you a scoped and well-defined project and goal. And so for information or help with anything, you can contact us at info@agsaa.org.